Welcome to the Liam Scheff Show on Truth Frequency Radio and UCY TV. In this hour, Ken Humphreys of Jesus Never Existed, JesusNeverExisted.com. When was it written, this thing that we call the Bible? And we're going to start with a question about Paul. Here's Ken Humphreys on the Liam Scheff Show.
Okay, let me qualify what you just said, dating the Bible. Let's be clear, that's too big a topic for this evening. We're talking about dating the New Testament. 27 books we're dealing with there, and about half of them are Paul's epistles. So, now why do people say they are the earliest? One of the anomalies we have, if we compare the epistles with the four Gospels, is that they don't mention each other. So here is Paul writing letters and he makes no reference to Gospels existing. And so it's a reasonable to conclude, well, then he wrote before the Gospels came into existence. Now, the church has a tradition that Paul himself died in the persecution, so-called, of the Emperor Nero. Now, that had to be before the year 68. Therefore, Paul exits the scene at the end of the 60s. So there we have a cut-off date for Paul, and we all know that Paul supposedly entered the scene, the Jesus story, only after Jesus had gone and he witnessed the martyrdom of Stephen. And so that gives us a starting point for Paul, and therefore his letters have to fit in that small period of time according to the traditional view. And according to that traditional view, they allow Paul to make one or two of his journeys before he starts writing. So the epistles come in round about 50 and then are finished by perhaps 65. So that is our very tight window for the epistles written by Paul. So then we start to add on to that in terms of the traditional or orthodox chronology. Well, then the Gospels followed suit. There are schools of thought, of course. Some believers try to get the Gospels very early. I've even seen suggestions that maybe Mark was written in the 40s, in other words, within a few years of the crucifixion. That is a very much a minority view, even among believers. Most of them now will put the Gospels in the last decades of the first century. So if we put Mark, let's say, round about the Jewish war, maybe just before, maybe just after, that's in the year 66, 70, if we get Mark there, then people choose, for no really good reason other than the fact it's a round number, they give 10 years or so for circulation of Mark before Matthew appears, maybe another 10 years before Luke appears, and then towards the end of the century we have the Gospel of John. So that would be the traditional framework, plus or minus a few years, depending on whose opinion is being given, and that is the traditional view.
Let me try, that's so much information for the newbie. We've just put Paul, you said something about a martyrdom of Simon?
Stephen, rather, not Simon.
Sorry.
According to the New Testament, the first Christian martyr was this chap called Stephen, who was not one of the original crew of Jesus, not one of the original disciples, but one of the deacons that were appointed by the church. And it's he, rather than anybody else, who stands up for the Christian cause in front of the Jewish high priesthood and doesn't talk about Christianity, but the betrayal of the whole history of the Jewish prophets, how they were never believed and they were all persecuted. And he basically tells the Jews where they've all gone wrong. And they get angry with him, and it leads to his stoning. And the consequences then, according to the book of Acts, then this young man called Saul, later to be known as Paul, enters the scene as witnessing the stoning of Stephen.
Now,
so that's where he begins.
Now, where does the stoning of Stephen occur in any book? Which part of the Bible and which part of anybody else's history?
Well, it occurs only in the New Testament, only in the book of Acts. And of course, it occurs later when Christians are writing commentaries on the book of Acts. So the only source for this so-called event is the book of Acts.
Just want to clear that up because, people listening would think, oh, well, this happened, and so it's reasonable to put Paul here. So there's a character, there are these epistles. The epistles never reference the Indiana Jones crusade of the book of Acts.
The book of Acts is probably the least worthy of all the documents there because it is a complete fantasy. It attempts to solve the problem which the early church had of linking this Jesus pageant that they've put in the first part of the first century with the reality of a church in the second half of the second century. You've got to link that together somehow, and the Acts of the Apostles tells, it would like to suggest, tells the story of the formation of the early church. So that's where it comes in. It's a document to justify the existence of the church, and it also does a great deal in terms of harmonising different trends and hostile sects within Christianity. But we can come on to that. But that is the story, and that story really begins with the martyrdom of Stephen, because it's basically saying this is the first persecution of the church.
So when, as far as anybody can tell, 50 is their, so tradition has it that Paul wrote in the 50s, but let's talk about history now.
Well, okay, let's talk about history. Well, there's a great deal of ambiguity and uncertainty regarding Paul. Now, I think Paul is too good to be true. Too, what does Robert Price calls in the amazing colossal apostle. Actually, when you start looking at Paul and thinking who he's portrayed as, who he represents, what he does, he towers over everybody else, arguably over Jesus himself, because he is so much. He almost single-handedly writes most of Christian theology, at least in outline. He careers across the Eastern Mediterranean, not once but several times. He establishes churches here, there and everywhere. And he is this great evangelist, and yet he succeeds, as every true Christian would want to from this period. He lands up in Rome, where he suffers martyrdom. So it's the perfect story of a fantastic early Christian. That's the sort of founder you would want if you were trying to dream up the ideal apostle. So I don't actually believe anybody quite like Paul ever actually existed. That's the radical comment that one has to make. Therefore, early dating of Paul gets to be very problematic. We really have to say, well, what we do have are the epistles. They're very real, that we do have copies of so-called Pauline letters. Where do we date those? People spend time working on, yeah.
Right, and I want to clarify that for the audience, because Christianity will have its way with you, because it will flood you and overwhelm you with stories. Well, we know that. Well, we know that. Well, we know that. Well, it's tradition has. Well, we know that. No, wait a second. How do you know it? Where do the letters come from? So I've been digging and digging and digging, and your webpage is at JesusNeverExisted.com, and your book, Jesus Never Existed, are excellent resources for the historian, amateur or professional, to dig in. One of the names that comes up over and over again in both Christian, what they call apologetics, and again, I say the Christian word apologetics is their word for them explaining what they think. I think they have to apologize because their arguments are so bad, so that's why I think they've taken that word. But they admit, and you point out, and Robert Price points out, that right beneath Paul is another character, and that's who provides the letters, at least the first letters of Paul, even according to Polycarp, who is an historical figure who was one of the early church writers or plagiarists, or whatever you want to call him. Do you know who I'm referring to? The guy who comes and says, hey, look what I found, these letters of Paul.
Are you referring to Marcion here? Are we already into Marcion?
Did I rush you?
Well, it depends on the audience and whether they can keep up with us. I would say, let's just make a point clear. With regard to Paul, or his early days as still a Jew called Saul, there is no secular evidence at all. Now, that is an important point to make, because with regard to Jesus, when you start saying, well, he didn't exist, people will point you to Tacitus, to Suetonius, they'll point you to Josephus and so on. They'll make pleas that, well, yes, there is a reference. Forget that all for a moment. When it comes to Paul, there is no other reference. And that's why this colossal character who meets with kings of the Jews, Roman governors, all this is mighty suspicious when you fact that nobody anywhere ever mentions this character. He's only found within the pages of the New Testament.
And for the most part, he's found in letters that reference his own greatness, his own troubles with his member in trying to control his member, his own shame. It feels like sexual shame. A
Yes.
lot has been made of the fact that he seems to be a closeted homosexual who hates himself, but that's for maybe another discussion.
This is, again, an important point. This so-called persecutor of the church, this is how Paul is portrayed. In the early pages of the New Testament, Paul persecutes the church. Having witnessed the stoning of Stephen, he went on to get the top job. This young man gets the top job, persecuting the church, and goes to the high priest and says, let me go and get the Christians up in Damascus. And off he goes to persecute and drag back the Christians of Damascus. But of course, we know on the way he encountered Jesus and got his new mission statement.
But what do you mean Now, this is funny, because whoever wrote the story of Paul didn't have him meet Jesus. He had him meet a place in his head. I mean, Paul, for being the chief witness to Jesus, was a bad witness to Jesus. He never met him.
Paul never met Jesus and makes no claim to have done so. In fact, his only encounter with Jesus, according to the book of Acts, it was on the road to Damascus. According to Paul's own epistles, he doesn't say anything about the road to Damascus. What he does say is God chose to reveal his son in me. Now, most people who study this don't actually think that refers to a road trip to Damascus. It means an inspiration in his own head that he felt he was getting a communication from the astral plane or somewhere. So Jesus spoke to him. It was revealed to him both in his mind and through his own reading of Scripture. So there's a mismatch there for a start. And what it all illustrates, to bring it into a nutshell, is none of this story stacks up as verifiable history. It makes a nice drama, because what does it prove? Why do they have this conversion thing for Paul anyway? Because it represents the conversion of a really bad Jew into a really good Christian. A theological point about conversion. The worst of the Jews, who was really good, a really good Jew, he boasts about how good a Jew he was, the really good Jew becomes the supreme example of being a good Christian. So it's a conversion story. That's why it's useful to the church.
Now, to be clear, again, this is the Liam Scheff Show with Ken Humphreys, author of the website and the books Jesus Never Existed, JesusNeverExisted.com. We're talking about Paul, the famous storied apostle, but he wasn't one of the disciples or apostles in what I call the Jesus novels or the Gospels. He's not there. He's not there at all. So he comes around much later and meets Jesus as the character in the story that we get has already been long dead, and somehow he comes to this one guy. That's not even in his own letters, but that's later put into the Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade of the Bible, the Acts of the Apostles, this very silly, very, very, very silly adventure yarn put in, as you say, to harmonize or to sort of draw in various threads from various stories and sell it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so he doesn't actually meet the guy. He says he hears a voice in his head. It's a very contradictory story, because sometimes he can hear it or other people can hear it, and sometimes they can't, and he seems crazy, but that's fine. Then he takes a trip all around the Eastern Mediterranean to visit some real places. Now, you've gone to some of these places.
Yeah, I'm trying to get to them all, but of course places like Damascus are a little bit problematic at the moment. Obviously, you can't see any evidence of Paul when you go to these places, and I'm sure many of your listeners may have done so. Or also, what you do find when you go to these places, you find pious Christian groups praying at these places, because, of course, for them it represents something very holy. But if you take a secular view of these places, what in nearly all of them you become aware of is that there was never any presence of Christianity until the 4th century. That's the one thing that strikes you. After the 4th century, you begin to get the first Christian graveyards, you get the first Christian churches, right? But before the 4th century, all you see evidence of is a vibrant paganism. So it just shows you this whole mythology that Christians love to kid themselves about their faith sweeping over the world and people being everywhere converting to Christ. It really doesn't leave any residue in the historical record. So that's why it's useful to go to some of these places. It's also useful to see what later church invented. For example, if you go to a place in Malta, you can see a column against which Paul was whipped. And that was only chosen like 2 centuries ago to be the very place where he was whipped. So you can see how the church was very invented in finding things that would inspire the faithful and strengthen their faith. So they've always done that. And it's quite entertaining to see these things that they've made.
It's as you say, Jesus land.
Yeah, Jesus land, exactly. And people will see what they want to see, of course. You go to a place like Philippi and you can see where the cell where Paul was imprisoned. Except that the archaeologists at Philippi will tell you that it wasn't a cell at all, it was a reservoir for the pagan temple. But, of course, in Christian eyes, they can see, well, that could be a prison cell, and that's where Paul was put. And so they will kneel and pray at that particular spot and feel comforted by it.
Well, so none of this is there in the archaeological historical record. This is a period of a voluminous writing about what was happening. You've got Michael Polkovich pointed out that there are some 150 or 60 or something like that writers of various stripes and sorts in the ancient world in and around the time of the fabled Ishu or Yeshua or Joshua or Jesus, whatever you want to call him. And none of them managed to so much as mention the magical being, let alone his magical servant who came later, Paul, who all theologians note is of 2 very distinct personalities, and you've noted it too. In the Acts of the Apostles, the Indiana Jones story where he has to get along with everybody, he's very nice and obliging and is a very good sort of Robin to everybody's Batman. Yeah,
I mean, if you read Paul's own epistles, assuming for the moment they are Paul's own epistles, you get a very clear picture of somebody who's a bit of a theological bully and a bombastic, self-opinionated, self-assured sort of creature. And it's very different from the image you get of Paul in the Acts of Apostles, where he's very much the team player, who's led rather than leads. And there is that mismatch, which even apologists can't entirely square, no matter how creative they are. There is a mismatch there. In the same way, there's not even an agreement in Paul's movements. When God revealed his son to Paul, according to Paul, he went off to Arabia and back to Damascus. But according to Acts of Apostles, he escaped from Damascus and joined the guys in Jerusalem. So the stories don't actually gel together at all well. But, of course, what we should recognise about Paul, because we do have these epistles, is what they represent. And they represent the battleground of early Christianity. Early Christianity fought the various groups and sects, schools of opinion within Christianity. They fought each other through various documents, many of which were given the name or identity of Paul to give it authority. Hence, widely now recognised that they're not all by Paul. There are later Catholic ones, for example. People will acknowledge, well, the Church wrote those. They are not really Paul. The Church wrote the Catholic epistles. And so you can see the whole body of that literature, which is a good chunk of the New Testament, is basically a theological battleground as to quite what to believe. And that's why within Paul there's an awful lot of contradictions.
Which gets to my question. When I look at something, in many ways I'm less interested in this story as to the model. I mean, call it almost a ruthlessly laboratory-based science. How do you know what you say you know? So the only thing that anybody really knows about this character called Paul is that there are scraps of papyrus or papyri left over, and there's an acknowledgement that the first letters of Paul came from an actual person, or somebody who's meant to be an actual person in history, who had an identity that wasn't magical, but that was very involved in theology. And that character was named Marcion of Sinope, which I think is on the Black Sea?
Yep.
So it's just around the corner. It's in the right area. And let me throw Marcion to you. And as far as anybody has been able to tell me, including the Catholic-managed pages in the Wikipedia, Marcion, fingers in the air making quotes, discovered the letters of Paul, and I don't have a perfect date, but somewhere in the 150s, somewhere around there.
Yeah, but around the mid-century, maybe 140, 150, somewhere in that time frame. It's difficult to be too precise. We know when Marcion was active. Now, when you come across Marcion, you discover quite an interesting character, and it sort of makes various bells ring in your head. You discover, well, he's supposedly a bishop from Sinope, as you say, on the Black Sea coast. His father was a bishop, so he's got even at that stage. He obviously came into the Christian fold at an early date, and you discover he was from a wealthy family of ship owners, and therefore had access to voyages around the Eastern Mediterranean. Makes you think, oh, who did that? Well, Marcion certainly could have done, being a ship owner, and he had his own take on what he believed Jesus represented, and his own theology, and a gospel which he presented in Rome. And since he sweetened the delivery of this gospel with some money, the church at first accepted it, but then decided he was beyond the acceptable limits of what they would believe, and so they split company and supposedly gave the money back. So he set up a separate church, which functioned by all accounts for 2 or 3 centuries until driven out of existence in the days of austere orthodoxy. So an interesting character for sure, and particularly because of his attachment to the Apostle Paul, or what was said to be the original gospel. We should perhaps state the major proposition here, which is that because this heretic, so-called, put together a gospel with several letters of Paul, as he said, here was a canon of material which the orthodoxy had to react against, and when they started to assemble their orthodox gospel, their New Testament, it was in reaction to Marcion. So that is the central proposition here, that the original New Testament was a reaction against an earlier gospel from Marcion. So it began with a heresy in the lights of orthodoxy. It began with a heretic and then was a reaction to it. So that's where we're at. And of course, where we're at, of course, now is in the 2nd century. We're not in the 1st century, we're in the 2nd century.
We're well into the middle of the hundreds. In case people wonder what 2nd and 1st century means, you always have to backdate it. So 1st century is 0 to 100, and 2nd century is 100 to 200. So we're in the mid-hundreds, and there's a fellow called Marcion. What's interesting, very interesting to me about his gospel, and he does write a Jesus novel, is that it's not a literalized novel. His Jesus is it's not the gospel of Mark, Matthew, Luke, or the strange gospel of the strange novel of John. His Jesus is not only he's not materialized the same way. The story isn't there. The whole beginning and middle and ending that we have, where he's born to a virgin, that's not there. So it's a very kind of different conception of this character, who you achieve really through believing. It's more Gnostic in flavor, and of course, the letters of so-called Paul, or I'm just going to call the letters of Marcion maybe from now on, are more Gnostic in flavor. It's about what you believe and the experience that you have, and that's what you get in these letters of Paul. It's not that there needed to be a physicalized guy. You just believe it. You just believe it. You have the personal experience. Another interesting point in Marcionism is that Jesus isn't the son of Yahweh. This is really specific stuff. The Jewish religion doesn't have anything to do with Marcion's religion. Jesus is God, Father, is the God of a cosmos, but not the God who created the world. That was the old Jewish God. So Marcion's God is a different, unrelated deity, as far as I have it from Price, Robert Price. So he's saying that we're not stealing anything from the Jews. We don't need their gospel at all. We don't need their Torah, their Talmud. That's theirs. Our thing is ours. We don't have to resent them, as Justin the martyr later came to say. Those aren't yours. Those are ours. We're stealing your little novels. So this is a very different religion, and that religion is found in Paul. And one of the problems that the church reader, the people in the church who actually read this stuff, have is reconciling the fact that the Jesus novels, the Gospels, are very, very different from this Paul stuff. Well, Paul outnumbers the Jesus novels. I mean, the Jesus stories are very, very short. You know, they don't take a long time to get from beginning to middle and end 4 times. It's not that much stuff when you look at the whole Bible.
That's true. Not all Christians warm to Paul. They find him difficult. They find him not a terribly sympathetic sort of character. They prefer the simple stories of Jesus.
Talking with Ken Humphreys of Jesus Never Existed, JesusNeverExisted.com, and the book about who wrote the Bible and when. Let's get back to the interview.
But you're absolutely right. There is this sort of mismatch there because, of course, one of the things that Christianity in the 2nd century is wrestling with is its relationship with Judaism and the Jews. Now, it's very instructive that the most important thing that happened in the 1st century was not birth of any saviour god, but the fact that the Jews went to war with Rome and got totally smashed by it. And then you had another event in the early part of the 2nd century when the Jews again revolted and got smashed and the Jewish kingdom was wiped off the map. These are events that cause people to start revising religion. And so you have to see this 2nd century as a period of turmoil and the explosion of multiple ideas about what Jesus could be and what he would represent and what he would say. And it's a battleground. There's no other way of putting it. It's a battleground for some sort of certain idea. Now, the problem with Paul is, of course, one of the problems with Paul is Paul just got inspired from God. Now, if other people did that, you'd have chaos. If everybody said, oh, God's just spoken to me and this is what he's saying now. So that's why they had to domesticate Paul. They had to bring Paul into the fold and remind people that the idea of getting the new messages from God, that's over now. Now we just accept. Now we have faith in what we've got. And so they had to solidify that story about Jesus. They had to have a definitive form. And that's why you've had these multiple revisions from the original Mark through Matthew's Judaizing version of Mark, and it's tidying it up and extended it. And then you had Luke's extension and changes again, and the extension into the Acts of the Apostle to make a more substantial product. And then, of course, they rather conveniently slot the epistles after those stories to infer that they come after all that has happened. But, of course, they came into existence in absolutely the opposite direction.
Well, they did come to existence in the opposite direction because in the mid-hundreds, Marcion finds, and there's a fellow called Polycarp who's working for the Roman version of the church, and probably writes some of the other letters of Paul, at least as per Robert Price, and I think that's good scholarship. There's this overlap of Marcion and then the church in Rome. And the church in Rome, they don't have a central unifying document. They just probably have a lot of people who are following the idea of this Christos, this christened, risen Savior. They don't know what their theology is. They're all over the place. You have this historical character called Justin, who became Justin Martyr, who died in, 168, 170, something?
Yep.
Okay, so he comes along, and he's writing somewhere around the same time. Does he mention Paul?
Well, no, one of the interesting things is that he doesn't mention Paul. Paul, who seemingly towered so importantly in the early years, in the 1st century, disappears. People don't refer to him. This is the oddity. For someone who's this mighty apostle, he has to be rediscovered in the 2nd century. There's a very dark period, but that's a dark period about all kinds of things relating to the early church. The fable in the 1st century is one thing, but how the church emerges is another. I mean, you mentioned Rome. Yes, there was no church in Rome. There were a number of schools, competing schools of thought in Rome before there was a church of Rome. And nobody really knows who founded the church in Rome. They're just traditions relating to Peter and Paul, but that's so uncertain. It all begins to crystallize towards the end of the 2nd century. Then you can have something you can identify as orthodoxy, and everybody who had a different view is then denounced as being a heretic who has strayed from the true path, which supposedly was clearly laid out from the very beginning. And this is where you can bring in your Polycarp, because there is a need to link the churches as they emerge under Catholic control with that story to give them legitimacy. How do you give them a legitimacy in terms of they can act as the spokesman for Jesus and the apostles? Well, the idea is you have to link them. You have to have a succession of bishops who have been appointed by their earlier bishops, who were themselves appointed by apostles. So here we have a link, and in that link, and it's quite interesting how the church fashions this link. They have Ignatius, the bishop of Antioch, and they have Polycarp, the bishop of Smyrna, another church in Asia. These two together form the links of orthodoxy, so-called. And if you read the writings of these characters, the epistles of Ignatius on the one hand, and at least one epistle of Polycarp and his martyrdom, right, these people are Orthodox Catholics in the extreme. Now, in the sense that they are not profound thinkers, they don't have much to say. All they say over and over again is obey your bishops and beware of heretics. So it's a very strong line, repeated ad nauseum. But what jollies up the stories of both of them is, firstly, they both reign as bishops for the magical 40 years, and they both die martyrdoms. They are both martyred for the church. So it's the perfect Christian biography. Now, when I come across any stories like that, it rings alarm bells in my head as to quite who they really were, if they were people at all. Because for all those 40 years in which they were supposedly illustrious bishops, there is not a word of their career, the progress of their church, or anything. Their story only really flowers when they're becoming imminently martyrs.
So let me stand corrected. Polycarp then is a figure. The number 40 appears so many times in the Bible. It's like people saying, a million now. Hey, I love, I love that. I do that a million times. Oh, let's do that a million. Whatever the number is in the culture, that means a whole hell of a lot.
That's what it is. Yeah, that's of course.
40 goes through the Bible over and over and over again. 40 days, 40 nights, 40 days in the wilderness, 40 years wandering in the desert, 40, 40, 40. There's a U2 song called 40 because they were brainwashed by Catholicism.
Yeah.
So
sure.
Polycarp then is not a Roman. I'm wrong. I stand corrected. You say he's from Smyrna. Is that also Turkey?
Smyrna is today's Izmir. Yes, it's on the southwest coast of Turkey. It was obviously a Greek city in the period we're speaking of, and Polycarp was a Greek. Arguably, you could say he was a Roman citizen. I don't know if he existed. That's possible. But he was a Greek. And one episode relating to Polycarp that is in the literature is that he went to Rome. Well, of course, that's what these would-be martyrs do. Of course, at some point they land up in Rome. And in Rome, he seemingly had an argument with the reigning pope at the time, and then returned to Smyrna, where he had his wonderful martyrdom. So he not only lived up until a very great age, like 95 or something, but he then at that great age didn't just die. And bear in mind, most people died by the time they were 40. At this great age, he was martyred, quite heroically as well.
Yeah, the story of his martyrdom, isn't it just riddled with sort of fictions like the fire wouldn't burn him sort of things?
That's right. He had to be killed about 3 times to make sure he was really dead, yeah.
So probably not historically true. Does that appear in any Roman history?
No, of course not. No,
okay.
It's a church legend. I mean, by this stage, everyone should cotton on to the fact that an early Christian has to, if you like, tick certain boxes. One of the things is that there's this life of righteous living, and always totally orthodox and Catholic, and certainly they end their days with this martyrdom. And of course, if you read the martyrdom of Ignatius, it's a side-cracking yarn. I mean, really, this guy pleads for being martyred. He can't wait. It's like Christmas to him, and he begs his friends not to rescue him. I mean, the whole thing is so ridiculous. So,
right.
In terms of transmission of documents, I know Robert Price does argue that Polycarp might well have been instrumental in writing them, and maybe the real Polycarp, if we could ever get near to him, maybe he did have a hand in there. But the one that we know of from the literature is as much a cartoon character as so many of the others.
Well said, well said. So Polycarp we receive is not the relation to any Polycarp, many fish who might have been in history.
The Christians create a dream state, not only of places that didn't exist and things didn't happen there, but they create a dreamscape of characters who perform in this imaginary world. And it's all nicely tucked away so early in time that nobody can really touch it or get close to it. And therefore, if you have faith, you just believe it. So it works. It works. It's worked very successfully for 2,000 years.
Now let's date it a little more accurately. There are no letters or epistles of Paul. There's no Paul in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, 100s, 10s, 20s, 30s, 40s. By the 40s, you get Marcion, and then you get the first two letters. I don't know if one of them is Galatians, but you get the first two letters of Paul in the hands of Marcion. That's sort of agreed as an historical trope. Now, whether that's 100% or whatever, it's certainly agreed from an historical perspective that Marcion found or presented the letters of Paul with a collection of letters of Paul with his Marcionite story of the God who wasn't the son of the Jewish God. So let's date it. Let's just date it.
Well, let's date it, but let's say a couple of things that we know now about the epistles, because some of them look like letters and most of them don't. Were they ever letters? Well, my point is I don't think any of them were ever real letters.
Right.
I mean, if you take, say, Romans, the epistle to the Romans, what is it, 9,000 words? That's bigger than most books that we know of from the ancient world. Now, this is a guy who's an itinerant preacher, working the people, as it were. Is he really going to sit down and write this massive tome, supposedly to a church that he's about to go and visit anyway? It doesn't add up. You don't have 9,000 word letters like that, let alone written to all the churches. They are not letters, but they might have been documents. Now, one thing one would have to say in favour of Paul, or at least somebody, because why were they called Pauline letters? Why did people want to attribute Paul as the author? And that's an interesting thing. Some theories there that it might have been a pen name for the little, Paulus meaning the little, therefore it was someone being modest, and maybe it was Marcion being modest and attributing that name to it. But at some point, certainly, you didn't just say this is a letter by John or Jack or Jill. You actually gave it the name Paul, so it had some cachet to call it a Paul. So at some point, maybe there was some early charismatic evangelist somewhere. I don't know. We can't see that. There's no way of seeing that at the moment. Maybe it was just derived out of Marcion's own mind in terms of just scripting an appropriate author for his words. Now, the other thing we should say, Liam, is that not only are they not letters, they are not simply one-off documents, in other words, written from beginning to end as is. We now know that they are composite documents, some of them composited from perhaps several letters in order to be the documents we know today as 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, 1 Thessalonians and so on. It's pretty clear that at a certain stage an editor has put together disparate documents and sewn them up and presented them as a letter. So that, again, sort of undermines their claims to be authentic correspondence. They are statements of church doctrine, but that's because they are stitched together from multiple sources. That's why you have those disconnects and those contradictions even within the single so-called letter.
So the letters are themselves not letters. They're too long, and nobody would probably write a letter to a church, to the people of an area. You'd write it to a person. That's not done. These are political dueling documents. They're almost like people putting out a statement on their blog.
That's right. Plus the fact, as everybody should know, none of them are dated, and it's mighty difficult to use internal clues to date these documents. It's almost as if someone's gone through them to make sure there's no way of dating them. They remain surprisingly enigmatic in that sense.
And the historical clues, people, Christians are like, well, they mentioned this person, they mentioned that person. And I think, That's called historical fiction. That's like saying that Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid was really filmed in the 1800s. So Christians were perfectly capable of writing historical fiction.
Obviously, we have to try and make progress with this material, and so that's why scholars, both orthodox and conservative and radical, study this material in order to extract some pointers which betray the true time of writing, and to see where the joins have been made and expose them and say, why did they say this at this particular time? Why are they attacking this particular heresy? When was this heresy around? Why would they have been attacking it? It must have been at that time. You can work on these documents, but certainty is not on offer, not at the moment. We can dismiss the orthodox story for sure. That doesn't add up in any direction at all. But there's still room for debate in terms of putting together what really did happen and when, simply because of the limitations on our sources.
I'm going to quote something from one of your pages on the first witness to these so-called Gospels. You quote Bart Ehrman, who gets a lot right and plenty wrong. It is interesting that the first Christian commentary on any text of Scripture that we know about came from a so-called heretic, a 2nd century Gnostic named Heracleon, who wrote a commentary on the Gospel of John. 2nd century, again in the 100s. Before I let you go, I want to try to nail down some dates loosely. We can throw out the 50s and the 70s. All of those are total inventions. There is no Gospel of Mark from the 70s. There is no papyrus of the Gospel of Mark from the 70s. There is no commentary on the Gospel of Mark from the 70s. There is no Paul from the 50s. We get Marcion handing over some letters of Paul. There would later be many letters of Paul that would be written. The church now has many pseudepigraphical. In other words, these are fakes. And they just are okay with that because that's the way they roll. They're fine, as long as it represents their overall message. And that was the message of the church founders. Perfectly fine to fake stuff because it sends the message. You have to know that that's what you're dealing with when you're dealing with the early Catholic Church. It's fine to fake it because we're here for the message. So we get Paul letters in the 150s. We get Justin Martyr writing about stories that he's heard, but they are different stories, or they're strong variations on what would later come to be recognized in our Jesus novels, with John the Baptist, sort of a vaguely or a more historical figure, bringing in the non-historical figure in to give him the crown, all that stuff. We're talking about the mid-100s for late 100s.
Yeah, this is the very productive time for Christian story mongering. Certainly there's a whole body of literature in circulation then, and you can only imagine how in small snippets of stories circulate between one village and the next, and people modify it, because of course all this is handwritten, and most people are illiterate. They have to be told these stories, so when a priest gets up and starts telling a story, he can add in his own bits, clarify this or amplify that, and so there's great fluidity in the whole tradition at this stage. It's not fixed, it's not gospel, it manifestly is not gospel. How on earth could Matthew, for example, do such a job on Mark if it was regarded as gospel? It's up there for grabs and modification, and that is what they are doing. What we should say, really, in the generalised sense, we're working back from the tradition that this whole body of literature was handed down from Christ to his apostles and then passed on to the bishops. It's all true, it's God's message, believe it, have faith. This whole thing necessitated making the gospel writers, so-called, into eyewitnesses, or as the church sometimes says now, near eyewitnesses, people around the scene. That is where they had to begin. It had nothing to do with historical validity. That's where they had to be. And so the whole tradition of New Testament dating has been tied to this early dating nonsense, because that's the only way you can say, well, these are eyewitness testimonies. Once you move that time interval out to a century or more, well, you know these stories are invented. You have sawn the legs off of the Christian claims. If the story was invented in the 2nd century, it is not true. It may have a moral message, it may be useful, but it is just not history.
That's the point for your famous rejoinder. It's not history.
It's not true. It's not history. It's more astounding rubbish.
From the New Testament. Ken Humphreys, I can't thank you enough for your time. If people want to find you and buy your book, can you tell them where they can look for you?
Oh, yeah. We're still flying high at JesusNeverExisted.com. The book has the same name. Easiest way of buying my book is from the website itself. Come and see. Come and see.
It's a wonderful set of historical references. As an historian or an amateur historian or a person in love with reading history and learning about the ancient world especially, I can tell you that what Christianity has done is to take actual history and take a thick layer of gesso paint, this white, covering paint or icing, and just put it over it to remove that thick, disturbing varnish, and then to see the actual history there, to recognize there was a Marcion of Sinope, to recognize that there might have been these people that called themselves bishops, and it might have been pretty, dodgy stuff. It might have not been, so venerated as we think. Somebody seized upon and wrote a much grander novel about younger people or people who have grown up in the era of Star Wars and Star Trek and Wolverine and X-Men know how we tell stories. We don't tell stories differently now than we told them then. And if you look at how we tell fictions today and interweave them and borrow from one from the other and take an historical figure and put it inside of a novel and expand it and really alter it, you'll begin to understand religion. And if you think that religion's magical, you're breaking a device that I call the mythometer. And the mythometer demands that you adhere to the laws of physics, biology, and history. Ken Humphreys, I thank you so much for your work. You're really delightful. I love that you keep a sense of humor through this stuff, and I love your historical research. It's been forgive me, but it's been a revelation to me. I've been filling in some historical notes that, I didn't even know were there. So thank you very much.
Thank you for the kind words. Thank you for the opportunity. I love talking about this stuff. I mean, actually, although we're dealing with basically a big lie, it's a fascinating lie. It's fascinating for me and probably for many people to actually understand what really happened and how we got where we are. But, yeah, been a great show, Liam, and I look forward to speaking with you on another occasion.
And we shall.